Oh, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Today, we are going to take a tour of different machine learning algorithms. We're going to talk about their pros and cons and when to use them. And we'll even look at some use cases. We won't get too technical, but there will be a little bit of math for reference and for fun, and just a little bit of code so you can see how it's done. So I am a classically trained statistician, and this is a lifelike image of me in grad school. Statisticians helped win World War II, but we were never considered cool. We were barely better than an actuary. Then, 10 years ago, we rebranded as data scientists, and we became rock stars. This was the sexiest job of the 21st century, at least according to Harvard Business Review. But that wasn't enough, so now we do AI. And AI is so hot right now. You hear all about it, so let's dive in and define artificial intelligence. One particular definition I like is this tweet from Baron Schwartz. He said, when you're fundraising, it's AI. When you're hiring, it's ML. When you're implementing, it's linear regression. And when you're debugging, it's printf. This has nice linguistic implications, and it helps deflate the hype. But I'm sure you're here for perhaps a more rigorous definition. So I really like this diagram from a book called Deep Learning by Goodfellow, Bengio, and Corville. It's a nested Venn diagram and has sort of become the successor to Drew Conway's famous data science Venn diagram. And you can see here that AI is this all-encompassing outer layer. And some people have described AI as what's hard for computers, but easy for humans. I'm not a fan of that definition because it's a moving goalpost. In the 80s, that was playing chess. Today, that's making restaurant reservations, so it keeps changing. But an important thing we can see here is that machine learning is the subset of AI. And today, when people usually talk about AI, they really mean machine learning. So let's define machine learning, also called ML. That takes us to another tweet I really like. This one really speaks to me. It's from the 10-year challenge that was popular a few years ago. It shows in 2009, it was statistics. In 2019, the exact same thing was machine learning. We've been doing machine learning or statistics, whatever you want to call it, for hundreds of years. We're just doing it faster and bigger now. And if you call it ML, you get paid more. So let's break down machine learning into three broad realms. These are reinforcement learning, which is semi-supervised learning. That's when you want to learn tasks, like how to play AlphaGo, how to play Pac-Man. Basically, how to teach a computer to be a human in games. Then you have unsupervised learning, which is mostly clustering. And that's when you want to group observations together. These groups go together, these observations go together, these observations go together, it's groupings. And then there is supervised learning. That's when you want to predict or explain something, like a regression or a classification. And today we are going to focus on supervised learning. It's the most common form of machine learning, and it's really powerful. And supervised learning can be broken down into different modes. These modes of supervised learning are determined by their outcome variable, what you are trying to model. Let's say you're trying to model a number, a numeric outcome. This would be a regression problem. These numeric outcomes as quantitative outcomes could be income, could be altitude, intensity, could be weight gain, heart rate. The idea is that the model will compute an average of the output conditional on the inputs. That's the idea behind a regression. The next most common form is binary classification. This is when you have two possibilities, like win, lose, live, die, whether you get sicker or you improve. Something is true or false. It's what class something falls into. And this extends naturally to multi-class classification. And the reason they're considered different is because typically in academic literature, you prove the two case first and the multi-case. It's easier to do the math that way. In this multi-class problem, it could be that you are looking at a suspicious trade and you want to know if it's fraudulent, a fat finger mistake, or bad judgment. Or maybe you have a picture of a vessel on water and you want to determine if it's a trawler or a speedboat or a fishing boat or a skimmer. Or maybe a patient has certain medical conditions and you want to figure out the best treatment for that patient, what is indicated. There's a number of different treatments they can get. Which one should they be classified as? While regression and classification are by far the most common, there's also count data. This is when you have numbers of things, like the number of accidents, number of lawsuits, number of children, number of deaths, or number of people who get sick. It's often overlooked and doesn't get the glory of the other methods, but it's very important, particularly in healthcare. Another important method in healthcare is survival models. This is when you look at health over time. You might be interested in the probability of someone dying, or the probability of a device failing, like an artificial hip. And you're generally looking at proportional hazards. Then you have ranking. This is when you want to say how important something is. Whether you're rating treatments by effectiveness, or you're ranking chess players, or best-selling products. And these are just a subset of the possible outcomes, but they're very common outcomes and therefore very common modes. Separate but related are the main machine learning algorithms. Each of these modes can be solved by multiple algorithms, and each algorithm can solve multiple modes. It's not a one-for-one correspondence. Today, we're going to focus primarily on regression, classification, and hazards methods, and a lot of them will be drawn from personal experience at Land Analytics. Just some of the algorithms that are available to you are linear and logistic regression, random forest, survival models, multi-level models, time series models, generalized additive models. There's far more than I can list here. There are many, many different ways to do this. And remember, each of these can solve multiple modes. There is a lot we can do. So let's start at the top. Generalized linear models, GLMs. They're probably most commonly thought of for regression problems, but they also work on classification and count data. The idea is that you want to model the outcome with linear math. In this case here, it's a regression. But again, it also does classification and count data. We have our outcome, which is numeric, or could be classification problems, and we want to relate our inputs to it. So we generally fit a straight line. Now, it doesn't have to be an actual straight line. That's not what linear means. It's linear in a mathematical sense. Our goal is to find the intercept and slope of this line. The intercept is a starting point, a baseline. And the slope is the effect of the income on the output. You model the output as a linear combination of the inputs. So you have your output y and your multiple inputs x1, x2, xp. Each input has a certain effect on the output. Those effects are the betas, beta 1, beta 2, beta p. These represent the effect, or the weight, also called coefficients. We have our data, and we want to see how our inputs relate to the outputs, and we do that by solving for these betas, which are the slopes and intercepts. Now, we could solve this with a pencil and paper, and I have done that. I'd rather let the computer do that. It's much more efficient that way. And this generalizes to the two-class classification problem. We have the same linear combination, but now our outcome is a logit, a log odds. That is the odds of something happening, the log of p over 1 minus p. And this does extend into the multi-class classification problem. Another GLM is dealing with count data, and here we have log of lambda as our outcome, and lambda is a rate. So it's the same idea for all of these. The left-hand side is different, that's the generalized part, and the right-hand side is the same, that's the linear part. It's a generalized linear model. These are very useful. They're your baseline. You just about always start here. They're understandable, they're fast, they're simple. But they're not without their drawbacks. The simplifying assumptions necessary for these generalized linear models don't always hold true. And it can be hard to capture complex relationships between inputs and outputs. Failings aside, they're very, very useful, and they're often a go-to model, at least for the first model. One particular use case is if you're trying to see if a treatment improves condition. And you can reason about this in a few different ways. Either they get better or they don't. For instance, cancer remission. Either get rid of the cancer or you unfortunately don't. That's a two-class classification. That would be a logistic regression. Or you can look at it as how much does a patient improve? Like how much is cholesterol lowered? In that case, that's a numeric outcome. That's a linear regression. And this is important for determining a treatment's viability. You need to know how good it is before you let people use it. And this model can be fit in R with one line of code using the GLM function, which is built into R. You call GLM for generalized linear model, and you relate your output Y to your inputs X1, X2, X3. And this can do a linear model, logistic model, Poisson model, and extensions of those. And here we're doing binomial. We say family equals binomial. Very common model, very, very common, especially in healthcare. And that's both from a pharmaceutical context and device context. Another common model for these problems is Cox proportional hazards. It's like a generalized linear model for expected survival time. You want to estimate the time till an event. The event could be failure, the event could be death. And that time to the event is associated with some input variables. So you're modeling probability of surviving or not surviving. And that's your hazard. Your hazard at time t, which is the opposite of survival, is modeled by h naught, some baseline hazard, times the exponentiation of that linear combination of our x input variables. And the goal here is yet again to model these betas in order to be able to estimate what someone's hazard is proportional to some baseline. You would use Cox proportional hazards if you want to estimate the time till an event. Again, not just survival, but device failure. If something is going to fail on you, you'd like to know when. And it works with censored data. Because when you have a clinical trial, I'm telling everyone in this room here that, a lot of you probably know this, that people drop out of the trial. They haven't died, but they're not in the trial anymore, and you need to account for their data no longer being present. And that's right censoring. Cox PH works with that. And it's commonly understood in its field. Now, what's wrong with a Cox proportional hazards model? Well, it assumes proportionality. And this can break down with too many inputs. It's a nice simplifying assumption, but doesn't always hold true anymore. Not necessarily that it ever held true, but nowadays we're realizing it and we have ways to get around it. But it's all over the place, like measuring vaccine efficacy, your risk of acquiring a disease. The baseline risk would be the placebo group because they haven't gotten the vaccine. And then the vaccine group, you would follow up with them at regular intervals or even irregular intervals if you need after they got vaccinated. And there are time varying inputs. And you want to see how the vaccine is doing over time. Now, we all have one particular vaccine on our minds right now, but other vaccines too. You need to see how long they last to know if you need to get a booster shot before you go on your next trip when people start doing that again. So it's very important to be able to see how long this lasts, the time to the event. And you can fit that by using the survival package in R, which is built in, and you call Cox PH instead of GLM. And the outcome is now composed of the time till an event, well, the current time, and whether or not an event has occurred, which is passed into the SIR function. That's modeled on our 3 input variables, and you can figure out which input variables affect your survival over time. And the pharmaceutical companies are itching to use R for clinical trials. They would love to do this. They're all just waiting for somebody else to do it first. And according to FDA guidance E9, Statistical Principles for Clinical Trials, no particular software is mandated. But the code does need to be well documented, which it should be, along with the versions and builds. So you could track the packages along with the code inside Git and wrap it all in a Docker container and get some really reproducible results. A more modern version of proportional hazards is random survival forests. We no longer need to assume proportional hazards. Instead, we can fit a survival tree. A survival tree is a type of decision tree, is when you take your input data and partition it recursively into a series of buckets. You get there and you ask a bunch of yes/no questions of your data. Is the number greater than a certain amount? Is it less than a certain amount? And you create these partitions, and the prediction from this tree would be the average of what falls into prediction. Trees are really nice because they capture nonlinearity, which is really prevalent in the real world. But instead of having just one tree, you can have a forest of trees. You grow hundreds of trees randomly, and then you average them together. This is called bagging, bootstrap aggregating. Each tree is built randomly, and the randomness comes into play both at the rows and the columns. When you're about to fit a tree, you randomly sample the rows you're going to use, and that already makes the trees be a little bit different from each other. But then as you're asking a series of questions of your input data, at each time you're going to ask a question, you'll ask multiple questions in a tree. Instead of examining all of the variables in your data set to decide what question to ask, you randomly sample a subset of those questions and then determine which question to ask based on that subset. So between these two levels of randomness, each tree is going to be different. And then you average them all together. This is the formula for an ensembled collection of survival trees. It's similar to regular random forest, but this is specific to survival trees. So that inside the square brackets is the hazard ratio. It is the number of events at time LH divided by the number at risk at time LH. And that's summed over a number of conditions. And that's an individual tree. And the outer sum is averaging all of the trees together. So this gives you your hazard at time t. You could do a regular random forest for regression, classification, or other problems, but this is a survival random forest. You would want to use a random survival forest because they give more powerful predictions than linear models, and they're more flexible than Cox proportional hazards. You no longer need to assume proportionality. And they're fast. Each tree is fast to grow, and you can grow all the trees in parallel. And they're easy to tune. And this will become important because machine learning is mostly just brute forcing your way through tuning parameters. It's sad, but that's true. The biggest problem of random forests is that they are very hard to understand. We know how they work, but not the reasoning behind those choices. And that can make people uncomfortable. They don't know what's going on. A great use for this is personalized risk assessment. Let's say you need cancer treatment. You want to know what your individual risks are as an individual patient. You don't want to be lumped into the average. You want to know your risk. And then you want to know the estimated effects of the different treatments for you. You want to know how they are going to affect you so you know how aggressive your treatment should be. You don't want to go by the averages. You want to know, do you need an aggressive course of action or a more mild course of action? And a random forest better helps predict the effects for individual users. And if you're that patient, you want it tailored to you. And this is a great use of machine learning to help people. And again, we could fit it with one line of code. This time we use the random forest SRC package, which stands for Random Forest for Survival Regression Classification. Our outcome variable is a serve object, just like CoxPH. We give it the time and whether or not an event occurred by time, and our inputs. And we get back a model. It's really nice. Let's turn our attention back to linearity for multi-level models. Multi-level models are linear models where the effects can vary by group. Here we have multiple regression lines, and each line has a different intercept and a different slope. That's because the model learns from the data as a whole, but then allows for nuance between groups. This takes advantage of structure in the data. Imagine you have schools made up of students. You want to see the overall quality of the school while accounting for differences between students. And this can handle many output types: regression, count data, classification data, many types. And we do this using Bayesian methods. And that's such a hot topic right now. It's so popular that The Guardian recently referred to it as an obscure math formula. That had stats Twitter a buzz because they said this isn't obscure, but if you're not in the field, this is obscure to you. And we see here we have our outcome variable, and then this is a linear combination of our inputs like we saw for GLMs, except all of our betas, our effects, have these subscripts, J sub I. That's because the effect will be different for each grouping of data. Multi-level models have a lot going for them. They give better predictions than linear models, and they allow for more complex relationships. They can understand group dynamics, which is a really nice feature to have. And for longitudinal data, they can handle the non-independence of repeated measures. And that's really important to capture. They're interpretable, and they even give you confidence intervals so you have a range of numbers. So what's wrong with them? They can be slow to fit because they often use Markov chain Monte Carlo, and they can be intimidating to people getting started. But this intimidation can be worth it. Let's say you're trying to predict hospital readmissions. You are getting ready to discharge a patient, and you want to predict if they're going to come back. You can't use a black box model because you want to understand why. Because if you know why, you can design treatments and try to prevent it. And these multi-level models will take into account the general population trends and also the individual characteristics of the people. And this builds a more complete picture. And ideally, you can design interventions so the patient doesn't return. And it's this personalized care that is enabled by a multi-level model. Following our trend, we could use one line of code, thanks to the rStanArm package from Andrew Gelman's team, which has the function stanGlimmer. This allows us to model global effects with group variations. Our outcome variable y is modeled by x1, x2, and 3, and those all have global effects. But then we see in the parentheses 1 plus x2, that means the intercept is allowed to vary by subject, and so is the effect of the second variable. So the first and third variables are measured from the global population, where the second variable is measured from the global population while picking up variations from the group level data. There are other packages that can do this, like LME4 and NLME, but I'm a big fan of rStanArm because it's full Bayesian. Somewhat related to this are generalized additive models, GAMs. These are linear models of wiggliness. Earlier, these points had a straight line going through them. Now we have a curvy line. And the technical term is wiggly. It is a wiggly line. And this is accomplished through a mixture of penalized basis functions. You have your outcome variable y, and this can be regression or classification or other types. And it is modeled on a linear combination of smoothing curves of the input x's. So each individual input, or groups of inputs even, have a smoothing curve fit onto them. And then our outcome variable is modeled against those smoothing curves, and that's how we estimate the effects of the smoothing curves of our input variables. And we want to, again, in the end, estimate those betas. And the smoothing curves are typically thin plate splines or tensor products, but there are others. As you can see, a lot goes into these. But you really want to use GAMs because they give you better predictions than linear models, and they allow for more complex relationships. They're more understandable than random forests, and they give you confidence intervals. And they could even be used for multi-level models. So what's wrong with them? Well, I'm still searching. These are magical. They can be a little bit slower than other methods, but they're so powerful, and they can be applied to so many domains, including a novel recent use case. People are very interested in the daily infection rates of COVID, or the daily hospitalization rates, or the daily death rates. And generalized additive models fit a nice smooth curve to this data. But we don't want to look at the curve itself. By looking at the derivative of the curve, we can tell if the infection rate or other metrics are accelerating or decelerating. And that's enabled because we have these smooth curves, which allows us to compute a derivative. And knowing whether it is accelerating or decelerating can help impact policies and what we should do and know if we're making headway or if we're falling behind. So GAMs can be very powerful. They can be very, very helpful. And the most common way to fit a GAM is with one line of code. Using the MGCV package, we call the GAM function, and we say our outcome y is modeled by smoothing curves of x1, x2, and x3. And that's all you would need to do. You can specify other types of smoothing curves, you can specify structuring of the data, and while a GAM can actually pretty well approximate the multi-level model just by doing a grouped smoothing curve, you could actually fit complete multi-level generalized additive models using the GAM4 package or the stan GAM function from rstan. And they are just so powerful and used in so many ways. I really think people should be using more of them. Turning to a completely different class of model is time series. This is when you have time-dependent data. When you want to forecast into the future based on previous time points. Usually, this is univariate, but it can also be multivariate. And you can see here, it can even be used for anomaly detection. Now, this will be some of the worst math we are looking at today. We have that YT in the middle. That's our data, what we're trying to model and predict. We have the backshift operators, the B's, and the superscripts, the D's, telling us how far in the past to look. Then you have the phi's and thetas, and those are the parameters we are trying to estimate. Those are the effects that we want to estimate. Now, this particular model is an ARIMA, autoregressive integrated moving average, all represented right here in this equation. There are other types of time series like ETS models and GAMs. Yes, you can use a generalized additive model for time series. That's how powerful they are. It's really amazing. But ARIMA models are perhaps the most common type of time series and one of the most powerful. Time series models are useful when you need to account for time. And time is everywhere. It's more places than you would realize. The issue with time series models is that they're only meant for time models. They're not meant to be used for other types of models. So that's the biggest drawback. And they are not straightforward to interpret. That's an issue that you might need to deal with, not knowing how they are, but you don't necessarily have a choice in that. And time is everywhere. Let's say you're trying to decide if you need to recall spinach. Every day, a certain number of people are getting sick from spinach, and you keep track of that, either on a national level, a regional level, a local level, and you collect this data over time, and you fit a model that predicts into the future, 1 day into the future, a week into the future, 2 weeks into the future, and you make these predictions and you get confidence intervals. And then you check, is the number of sicknesses outside the confidence interval bands? And maybe you need to say that more people than expected are getting sick for a certain number of days in a row, And at that point, you'll make a recall. So time series methods can be crucial to saving lives. And it's amazing how powerful they are that based on the past, they can see into the future and say when something seems out of whack. And that's anomaly detection. And not for nothing, but I've never seen pizza recalled. It's never hurt me. So maybe we should stop pushing spinach so much and have more pizza. Fitting a time series model can be done in many ways, but I like the Fable package from Rob Hyndman's team. Again, we have one line of code, the model function, and it's very generically named model because you give it the data, and then Y being which column in the data set you want to use, and then you specify the type of time series model. Here it's an ARIMA, but you could do other models like ETS and other ones. And when you call ARIMA, it fits a number of different types of ARIMA models all automatically for you and picks the best one. This one line of code does so much work for us that we don't need to worry about. It's really, really powerful. You've probably heard a lot about deep learning, also called neural networks because they were loosely inspired by the brain. Keyword loosely. You take your input data, and before you can relate it to your output data, you have to go through a series of hidden states. You take your input layer, and you relate it to your first hidden layer. You then relate that hidden layer to a second hidden layer, and the second layer to a third hidden layer, which is finally related to your outputs. This is all the rage. There is so much hype. But I think it's really just extreme nonlinear modeling. You take your input X and you multiply it by a set of weights. And this is an affine transformation, a linear transformation. You then call a nonlinear activation function on that outcome, on that transformation. And that's where all the power comes from, the nonlinearity, because there's so much nonlinearity in the world. And that gets you your first hidden layer. You take that hidden layer, multiply it by a different set of weights, call a nonlinear activation function, and you get your second layer. And you repeat this until you get to your last layer, and you multiply that last layer by a set of weights and relate it to your outputs. You have all of these weights, which have taken the place of our betas because it's a different notation, and you need to estimate all of these weights. And there can be millions of them. For a fairly simple model, you could have millions of weights. And that could be very hard to estimate. And a lot of hard work goes into estimating all of those millions of weights. And everyone wants to do deep learning these days because it gives you extremely good predictions, especially for vision and language. There is a lot of hype, but it does give you strong predictions for certain domains. The issue is that they are a complete black box. You have no clue what's going on inside. And they are slow to fit. So slow that you probably want to use a GPU, or more likely multiple GPUs. These can be expensive to obtain if you can even find one these days, and they consume a lot of electricity. And they are slow to tune. There are so many tuning parameters. You have the number of layers, the size of each of those layers, the batch size as you chunk through the data, the epochs, which are the number of passes over the data, the learning rate, the type of optimizer, the dropout percentage, batch normalization, the type and amount of regularization. This makes other machine learning models look easy. But the results can be pretty amazing. Looking at a brain, apropos for neural networks, let's say you have a scan and you want to detect lesions in the brain. You could train a deep learning model to identify and point those out to you here in the colored areas. There has been great strides in radiology. If you want to detect cancer or herniated discs, and it can also diagnose other ailments in the body. It's amazing what we can do with deep learning these days if you have a large enough training data set and you can fit a good enough model. But deep learning is harder than what we've seen so far. No more one-liners. This uses the torch package, And we're fitting this simple network here with one layer with 32 nodes in it. We had to choose our optimizer, in this case, Atom, in the learning rate of 0.08. We make 200 passes over the data, which can be time consuming if you have a lot of data. We make a forward pass on the model. Essentially, it's the expectation step. And then we do a back propagation to compute the derivatives. And we do this repeatedly. It's a lot of work. And this is a simple model, and I've left out a lot of it. I've really condensed it. The two most popular frameworks for fitting deep learning models are Torch and TensorFlow. There are others, but these are the biggest. And they are all open source. Everything we've seen today is open source. That's free as in speech and as in beer. You can audit the code and you don't have to pay for it. And this fosters innovation. It would be great for clinical trials to be using more open source. It would lead to so much good in the world. And you have to take care of the community because open source brings value, both intrinsic and economic. A lot of the projects we do for the Department of Defense, they insist that we use open source tools and that we open source the work we do when it's appropriate. That's how important open source is. And if you benefit from the community, it's important to contribute back to the community. If you want to learn more about open source, I run the New York Open Statistical Programming Group, which is a meetup group, and my HackR for learning about open statistics and programming and data. Also, I run open source conferences in New York and government related. Come join us, join the community, be a part of the community, contribute to the community, and really make a lot out of this community. It's so important. And all this machine learning, including open source, where is all this being done? Who is doing all this? I've been sharing firsthand knowledge so far for this talk. And we've helped a lot of customers. This is just a small subset of our customers, the ones that let me mention them publicly. At these companies, we have various different types of machine learning. With Carfax, we helped model car prices. Macmillan had us forecast book sales. And the Minnesota Vikings brought us in to do their draft picks a few years ago. And now draft day is tomorrow, so we're all very excited for them because we implemented hundreds of machine learning models to help them get the best draft in their draft class. And we've done many projects of pharmaceuticals, but unfortunately, none of them would let me list who they are, which is a shame because we've done some really fascinating projects. Some examples which I can gloss over and not mention the companies, we helped model the variability in the manufacturing of drugs so you can know how to make them more efficiently. We forecasted weekly prescriptions, and we helped another one integrate open source into their research. And those are just a few examples of what we've done for pharmaceutical companies. And these are just a few examples of companies we've worked with. We can't name all of our companies, but we've worked in so many other industries, ranging from manufacturing to pharmaceuticals to food producers, banking, defense, legal, politics, finance, insurance. We're a small company, and we've touched all these industries. Imagine what is out there. Imagine what's being done. So to draw down on everything we have seen today, machine learning can model many types of data. There are many modes, whether that is numeric data, classification, count data, survival rates, rankings. And remember, the outcome type dictates the mode. Once you've determined your mode, you then choose your model. And there are many model types: generalized linear models, tree-based models, Bayesian methods, deep learning, just to name a few of them. And each of these model types can solve multiple outcome types. And there are countless use cases, whether you want to look at treatment efficacy, or you want to detect bad products, or anomaly detection, or image recognition. There are so many things you can do, you're only limited by your imagination. And you can do all of these things in just about any industry, whether that's government, the private sector, academic, nonprofit. Everyone can use this. The key is knowing when to apply which model, knowing the right method for a given problem, and knowing when the gains are worth the investment. Sometimes simpler is better and faster. So hopefully now you have a better sense of what to look for. Thank you very much.